The Texas sun blazed down on the dusty stretch of highway that led to the prison. Its relentless heat made the dry earth shimmer, a constant reminder of the harsh life inside the walls of the penitentiary. Inside those iron gates, where the most dangerous and ruthless of criminals roamed, a silent fury was simmering. It was a fury that would soon boil over into bloodshed. Officer William "Billy" Richardson had been a staple at the prison for over 2 decades. He was a middle-aged man with a stocky frame, hardened by years of working with the worst of society. His hands were calloused from gripping the heavy iron bars of the cell doors, and his eyes, once bright with hope, were now dimmed by years of seeing too much suffering and cruelty. Richardson had long since stopped caring about the inmates' stories of hardship. To him, they were just criminals who deserved their punishment. But there was one inmate who had started to get under Richardson's skin, and that was Jesse "Tex" Whitaker, a 29-year-old Texan with a reputation for causing trouble wherever he went. Tex was serving time for armed robbery, but his violent tendencies had earned him a reputation as one of the more dangerous men in the prison. His rugged features, long brown hair, and piercing blue eyes made him stand out in the sea of prisoners. Despite his violent past, Tex had a certain charm about him, a raw magnetism that drew people in, even those in positions of authority. Billy Richardson had always been cautious around Tex, but there was something that kept him coming back to the young man's cell. Maybe it was the way Tex had talked about the hardships he'd faced growing up on a ranch in rural Texas. Maybe it was because he reminded Richardson of the man he used to be, strong, confident, but with a tragic edge. Whatever the reason, Billy started to feel a connection to Tex, a connection he knew he shouldn't have. Then one fateful day, that connection would turn deadly. It all started with a rumor that spread like wildfire through the prison. Billy had been involved in a secret, illicit affair with several of the inmates. The affair, a tawdry threesome between Richardson and two young prisoners, was said to have occurred one night in the prison's solitary confinement block. Inmates whispered about it behind closed doors, but no one dared to speak openly of it. They knew that crossing the line with a prison guard could lead to dire consequences. Still, the whispers were enough to set the stage for what would follow. Tex, being the manipulative and cunning individual he was, saw an opportunity in the situation. He was always looking for a way to gain leverage over others, especially over those in power. When he learned of the affair, his mind began to churn with a deadly plan that would bring the truth to light, but in a way no one could have predicted. For weeks, Tex kept quiet about the affair. He watched Richardson closely, taking note of every subtle movement, every exchange of glances with the other inmates. But what he didn't know was that the affair was just the tip of the iceberg. Billy had done something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. He had infected the two inmates involved in the threesome with HIV, a dark secret that would come to haunt him. Tex, whose own world was ruled by violence and distrust, began to unravel the twisted truth about Richardson's betrayal. Inmates who had once respected the guard now whispered that he was a traitor, a man who had taken advantage of their vulnerability and condemned them to a lifetime of suffering. The quiet rage that had simmered inside Tex for years now had a focus, a reason to ignite into a firestorm of revenge. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the prison settled into its usual rhythm of clanking metal and muffled voices, Tex decided it was time to act. He'd gathered enough information, and now it was time to put his plan into motion. The sound of boots echoing down the hallway was drowned out by the steady thrum of Tex's heart as he slipped into the shadows. Richardson was just a few cells away, unaware that his own life was about to end. Tex knew the prison better than anyone, and he had a plan that would leave no trace. A plan that would make sure Richardson would never hurt anyone again. And so, in the dimly lit corridors of the Texas State Penitentiary, the stage was set for a murder that would shake the prison to its very core. As the prison guard turned the corner, Tex sprang into action, his movements swift and calculated. It wasn't personal, it was justice. The man who had betrayed his trust, the man who had played with their lives, was about to meet the consequences of his actions. With a single brutal strike, Tex made sure the guard would never see another sunrise. Billy Richardson's body would be found the next morning, lifeless and cold. The news would send shock waves through the prison, but Tex's plan had only just begun. What the authorities didn't know was that the truth about the affair and the HIV infection was about to come to light in a way they could never have anticipated. The murder of Billy Richardson would set in motion a chain of events that would expose the darkest secrets of the Texas State Penitentiary. But for now, all that remained was the silence of the prison, broken only by the distant sound of a heavy door clanging shut as another chapter of its twisted story began. The morning after Billy Richardson's death, the prison was in chaos. The guards scrambled to contain the panic, while the inmates stirred with whispers of what had happened. Billy Richardson was a seasoned officer, a man many had respected. His sudden, violent death sent shockwaves through the institution. How could such a thing happen behind those high walls? Detective Laura Jenkins was called in to investigate. She was a seasoned investigator, with a sharp mind honed by years of working criminal cases. Tall, confident, with a no-nonsense attitude, she was the kind of investigator who thrived under pressure. The prison had seen its fair share of violence, but Jenkins had a feeling this case was different. Richardson's death didn't feel like an ordinary prison killing. There was something deeper at play, and it wasn't going to be an easy case to crack. Her first task was to visit the scene of the crime. The scene was grim. Billy's body was discovered lying face down in the hallway near the solitary confinement block. The bloodstains around him were dark and pooled into the cold concrete floor. The area was eerily quiet, save for the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. Jenkins crouched beside the body, observing every detail. Richardson's face was frozen in a look of shock, his eyes wide open, unblinking. There were no signs of a struggle. His uniform was undisturbed, which struck Jenkins as odd. Inmates, particularly the more violent ones, tended to make a mess of things when they fought. But Richardson's body looked almost too orderly. She examined the area around the body, noting the lack of physical evidence. No weapon, no blood spatter to indicate a fight. It was as if the attack had been swift, calculated, and deliberate. Jenkins turned to the guards who had found the body. "Who was the last person to see Officer Richardson alive?" she asked, her voice cool and commanding. A guard, a young man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "I was. I saw him just before my shift ended, heading down this hall. He didn't seem like anything was wrong. Everything seemed normal. Did he have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm him?" Jenkins pressed further. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting around. "Well, there were rumors, but no one thought it would come to this. He had some issues with some of the inmates." "Like what?" "Nothing specific, just rumors about him being too close to some of the prisoners. Some of them didn't like it." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Too close? How?" The guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to talk. "There were stories about some illicit relationships. Nothing confirmed. But there were talks." Jenkins stood up slowly, processing what she had just heard. If these rumors were true, they could point to motive. Officer Richardson had broken an unspoken rule within the prison, crossing the line with inmates. It wasn't uncommon for guards to get involved with prisoners, but it was always done in secrecy. If those relationships turned sour, they could easily lead to violence. She turned to the other officers standing by. "I want a list of all inmates who had direct contact with Officer Richardson. Start with the solitary confinement block. We need to find out everything we can about his relationships with the prisoners." As Jenkins moved through the prison, speaking to the staff and inmates, it became clear that Officer Richardson's connections to the prisoners were more complicated than anyone had first realized. Several inmates had already been flagged for suspicion, but one name stood out in particular: Jesse "Tex" Whitaker. Tex was a known troublemaker with a history of violence, and he had a reputation for using his charm to manipulate others. The rumors of his violent tendencies and his cunning intelligence had not escaped Jenkins's notice. She knew that Tex was someone she would need to pay close attention to. After a few more hours of questioning, Jenkins finally made her way to the cells. The stark white walls of the prison felt like they were closing in on her as she passed row after row of hardened criminals. She stopped in front of Tex's cell, which was at the end of the row. Tex was standing by the bars, his piercing blue eyes locking with hers as she approached. Jenkins took a moment to study him. Tex had the kind of face that could make a person uncomfortable, a rugged handsomeness that seemed to mask something far darker underneath. His eyes, cold and calculating, never wavered from hers. "Jesse Whitaker?" Jenkins asked, her voice steady. "Yeah, that's me," Tex replied, his voice smooth, almost too calm for a man in his position. "I need to ask you some questions about Officer Billy Richardson," Jenkins said, her gaze unwavering. "Where were you the night he was killed?" Tex's lips curled into a slight grin. "You think I did it?" "I'm not ruling anyone out," Jenkins replied firmly. "I'm asking questions, and I expect answers. Where were you?" Tex leaned back against the bars, crossing his arms over his chest. "I was in my cell, alone." Jenkins didn't believe him. There was something about the way he said it, the way his eyes flickered briefly to the side, that made her suspicious. But she kept her cool, pushing forward with her questions. "Did you know Officer Richardson personally?" she asked. Tex's expression shifted slightly. "Sure. He was a guard. He did his job, I did mine." "Did you have any disagreements with him?" Tex paused, then let out a slow chuckle. "Disagreements? I don't have disagreements with people like him. He's a guard, I'm an inmate. There's a clear line." Jenkins could tell that Tex was holding something back. He was playing the part of a polite, cooperative inmate, but she had seen enough in her years of investigation to recognize the signs of someone hiding the truth. She needed to get under his skin. "Rumors have been going around about your involvement with Officer Richardson," Jenkins pressed. "Are those rumors true?" Tex's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, his calm demeanor cracked. But it was only for a moment, and he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice even. "Rumors are just that, rumors." Jenkins studied him for a moment longer before turning away. "We'll be in touch," she said over her shoulder. She wasn't satisfied with his answers, but she had learned enough for now. There was more to uncover, and Tex was definitely involved. She could feel it in her gut. As she left the cell block, Jenkins knew that the case was far from over. There were secrets buried in the walls of this prison, secrets that would take time to unravel. But one thing was certain: Billy Richardson's death was not a random act of violence. Someone had orchestrated it with careful precision, and that someone, Jenkins was sure, was hiding in plain sight. The investigation into Officer Billy Richardson's death was progressing slowly, but Detective Laura Jenkins had already begun to piece together a pattern. The whispers of an illicit affair, the rumors of Richardson's connections to some of the inmates, and the quiet but dangerous behavior of Jesse "Tex" Whitaker all pointed to a single, chilling conclusion. The murder was not an act of random violence. It had been meticulously planned, with a calculated motive lurking beneath the surface. Jenkins had spent the last few days sifting through Richardson's history, his records, his disciplinary reports, any notes that might indicate a history of misconduct, but nothing concrete had emerged. His record was relatively clean. He had served his time as a dedicated officer and had no major complaints filed against him by inmates or staff. But there were whispers, as there always were in a place like the Texas State Penitentiary. The staff were tight-lipped, and the prisoners, as always, were less than forthcoming. But the more Jenkins dug, the clearer it became that there was something the prison was trying to hide. It wasn't long before Jenkins realized that she needed to shift her focus. The affair rumors were more than just idle gossip. Someone had a deep reason to kill Billy Richardson, and Jenkins suspected that it wasn't just the sex that had triggered the violence. The HIV infection, though not widely known yet, was the missing link. That revelation would send shockwaves through the prison, and once it did, the motive would become much clearer. Tex was her main suspect, but Jenkins knew she couldn't just arrest him on a hunch. She needed to build her case, piece by piece, and her first step was to investigate the background of the two inmates who had allegedly been involved with Richardson in the affair. They were the key to understanding what had truly happened. One inmate, a young man named Timmy the Kid Henderson, had been identified as one of the participants in the affair. He was serving a sentence for drug trafficking and had only been in the prison for a few years. He had a reputation as a troublemaker, known for his quick temper and his inability to keep his mouth shut. The other inmate, a man in his mid-30s named Marcus "Big Mark" Donovan, had a longer history with the prison. He had been convicted for armed robbery and had spent the majority of his adult life behind bars. Big Mark was a giant of a man with a solid build and a gravelly voice that made even the toughest of prisoners think twice before crossing him. Jenkins arranged to interview both men, hoping that one of them would crack under the pressure and reveal what had really happened. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Inmates like Henderson and Donovan had nothing to lose, and they were experts at lying and manipulation. But Jenkins had a way of getting to the truth, and she wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. Her first interview was with Timmy Henderson. He was a scrawny, jittery man, his face pale and twitching as he sat across from Jenkins. His hands trembled as he fidgeted with the cuffs that bound him to the chair. He looked like a man on edge, as though he was constantly worried someone might come for him. Jenkins wasted no time getting to the point. "Tell me about Billy Richardson," she said, her tone calm but firm. "What can you tell me about your relationship with him?" Henderson's eyes darted around the room nervously, his lips twitching as if he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, he spoke in a voice so low Jenkins had to lean forward to catch his words. He was a good guy, at least at first," Henderson said, his voice shaky. "He treated me like a person, not like an animal. We started talking, and he got real friendly with me. He was, I don't know, different than the other guards." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "He would talk to me, like we were equals or something," Henderson said, his voice trailing off. He even got close to me. But it wasn't just me. He was close to other guys too, real close." Jenkins kept her face neutral. "What do you mean by close? What kind of relationship did you two have?" Henderson looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. We didn't just talk. There were some nights when he'd come to my cell. We got physical." "Physical how?" Jenkins pressed, her eyes never leaving his. Henderson's eyes filled with shame, but he continued. He had sex with me. Not just me, though. There were other inmates, too. It wasn't just one-time stuff. It went on for months." Jenkins felt a chill run through her as the pieces started to fall into place. Richardson had used his position to manipulate these men, to exploit their vulnerabilities. But Jenkins wasn't sure if this was all the truth. There was more to the story, and she knew it. "Did he tell you anything about the other inmates? Did he ever mention Jesse Whitaker?" Jenkins asked, her voice cold. Henderson's eyes went wide. "Tex?" He hesitated. "Yeah, I think Tex knew about it. He'd be around sometimes, watching. He didn't seem like he was involved, but I don't know. He was always around." Jenkins' suspicions grew. It wasn't just the affair itself. There was something deeper, an infection, a betrayal that was festering under the surface. She had to speak with Big Mark next. When she entered Big Mark's cell, the air shifted. The man was a towering presence, his broad shoulders almost taking up the entire space. He sat in the corner, arms crossed, staring at Jenkins with an unreadable expression. Unlike Henderson, Mark didn't seem nervous. He seemed calm, almost too calm. "Big Mark Donovan," Jenkins began, her voice steady. "I need to ask you about Officer Richardson." Mark didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his piercing gaze making Jenkins feel like he was sizing her up, looking for a weakness. "I heard you and Officer Richardson were close," she continued. "What can you tell me about that?" Big Mark's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective," he said in a gravelly voice. "I'm just doing my time. That's all." Jenkins wasn't buying it. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. We know about the affair. You and Henderson were involved, weren't you?" Big Mark's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. He looked away, his eyes focused on the far corner of the cell, as if trying to avoid the question. Jenkins pressed on. "We also know about the HIV infection, Mark. Did Richardson give you something you didn't ask for?" The air in the cell grew heavy. Big Mark's face hardened, and he turned his gaze back to Jenkins. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly, but his voice held an edge. Jenkins knew she was getting closer. The infection was the key to everything. But now she had to piece together how Richardson had infected his victims. And why? Was Tex involved in this too? She needed to know. As Jenkins left the cell, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a prison killing, a betrayal, a deadly conspiracy, and at the heart of it all was Jesse "Tex" Whitaker. Detective Laura Jenkins had barely returned to her office when a call came through that made her pulse quicken. The DNA results from the crime scene were in. The lab had run tests on the blood found around Officer Richardson's body, and the results had confirmed something chilling. There was HIV in the blood. Jenkins' gut twisted at the realization. Richardson had infected at least one of the inmates, and it was clear that whoever had murdered him had learned about the disease and made it the cornerstone of their vengeance. The truth was finally taking shape, and it was far darker than Jenkins had anticipated. The HIV infection wasn't just a side note. It was the driving force behind Billy Richardson's murder. What started as an illicit affair between the guard and the inmates had escalated into something much more sinister. The infection was the spark that ignited the fire of rage, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Jenkins sat at her desk, staring at the file in front of her, deep in thought. She had spoken to both Timmy, the Kid Henderson, and Marcus Big Mark Donovan, and their testimonies were inconsistent at best. They each admitted to some form of involvement with Richardson, but claimed innocence when it came to his death. But one thing was clear. They were hiding something. The moment Jenkins had mentioned HIV, both men had grown defensive and evasive, as if they feared their involvement in the scandal would be exposed. They were not just angry with Richardson, they were afraid of the consequences that would follow the discovery of their infection. But the real question that had been nagging at Jenkins was whether Jesse "Tex" Whitaker was the mastermind behind the killing. All roads seemed to lead back to him. His calculated demeanor, his manipulation of those around him, and his proximity to the affair suggested that he knew much more than he was letting on. But Jenkins needed proof. She had learned by now that suspects like Tex were incredibly adept at playing their cards close to the chest. She turned her attention back to the prison's medical records. Jenkins had subpoenaed a list of the inmates who had tested positive for HIV over the last year. She didn't want to make assumptions, but the pieces of the puzzle were starting to align. The prison had a strict policy of keeping medical information confidential, but Jenkins was persistent. She knew that the revelation of HIV would tear apart the fabric of prison life if it came to light. Guards and inmates alike were reluctant to expose such a disease for fear of the stigma, but if Tex was involved, he would stop at nothing to protect himself. The file Jenkins received contained the names of 3 inmates who had tested positive in the past year: Timmy Henderson, Marcus Donovan, and Jesse Whitaker. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Tex had been infected by Richardson, just like the other 2 inmates. But there was more. Tex's status had only recently been confirmed. His test results had been sent to the medical ward just weeks before Richardson's death. It seemed that Tex had learned about his condition only days before the murder. Jenkins paced back and forth in her office. Tex had been exposed to HIV, and Richardson had been the one to pass it on to him. What's more, he had known about it. The rage, the betrayal, the feeling of being condemned to a lifetime of suffering. It was the perfect storm that had driven Tex to murder. The question now was how to confront him. Tex had always been clever, calculating, and he wouldn't give anything away without a fight. Jenkins knew that she would have to play her cards carefully. She needed him to slip, to reveal the one piece of evidence that would confirm her suspicions. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing to interrogate him directly, Jenkins would attempt to manipulate the conversation, pushing Tex to reveal his hand. She made her way to Tex's cell once again. The moment she entered, Tex was waiting for her, leaning casually against the bars as though he had been expecting her. His calm demeanor unnerved her, but Jenkins wasn't intimidated. If anything, it only made her more determined to get the truth. "Jesse Whitaker," Jenkins began, walking into the small cell and standing a few feet away from him. "We need to talk about your involvement with Billy Richardson." Tex didn't even flinch. "Again with the questions, huh?" He let out a mocking chuckle, looking her up and down. "You're wasting your time." Jenkins studied him carefully, watching his every move. He was calm, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something hidden. She took a step closer, narrowing her gaze. "We know about the affair, Tex, the one with Richardson. You were involved. Tex straightened up at the mention of the affair, but his expression remained unreadable. I told you I wasn't involved in any of that. What happened between Richardson and those other inmates is none of my business. Jenkins took another step forward. It became your business when you were infected by him, didn't it? The look in Tex's eyes shifted, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something dark flashed across his face, but it was gone so quickly, Jenkins could almost convince herself she'd imagined it. You don't know what you're talking about, Tex said, his voice low. It's not what you think. But Jenkins wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm. You knew about your test results, Tex. You knew Richardson had given you something that would change your life forever. He betrayed you, just like he betrayed those other men. Tex's breath hitched ever so slightly, but he recovered almost immediately. He turned away from her, walking toward the back of his cell. Jenkins could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fists clenched. He was losing control. Is that what you think happened, detective? He said, his voice tight with restrained anger. That I killed him because of some disease? Jenkins let him stew for a moment before speaking again. What other reason could there be? You were infected by Richardson. You felt betrayed. You sought revenge. The pieces fit, Tex. Tex turned back to face her, his eyes now burning with a cold fury. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice ice cold. You think I killed him because of a disease? Number, I killed him because he deserved it. Jenkins took a step closer, her heart racing. This was it. Tex was about to crack. She could see it in his eyes. He was struggling to maintain his composure. You killed him because he took something from you, didn't he? Jenkins pressed. He used his power to manipulate you, just like he did with Henderson and Big Mark. He played with you, and you couldn't let it go. You couldn't forgive him for what he did. Tex's eyes flashed with anger. You have no idea what it's like to live like this. To be stuck in this hellhole, knowing that every day you're closer to death. He infected me, and I'm not going to just let it slide. He ruined my life. Jenkins could feel the weight of his words, the raw pain in his voice. But beneath that pain, there was something darker. Something that confirmed her theory. Tex had killed Richardson, not out of a moment of rage, but as part of a calculated plan to exact his revenge. She straightened up, her voice steady. You're right, Tex. I don't know what it's like to live in your shoes, but I do know that you had a choice. You didn't have to kill him. You could have gone to the authorities, but instead, you chose to silence him forever. Tex said nothing. His eyes burned with hatred, but it was clear to Jenkins that he knew he was cornered. The game was up. I'll be back, Jenkins said, turning toward the door. But remember, Tex, you can't hide from the truth forever. It's coming for you. As she left his cell, Jenkins felt a sense of finality. She had enough now to bring him in, but she needed to be absolutely certain. She would need to gather the last pieces of evidence to confirm the link between Tex's HIV status and Richardson's actions. But she knew one thing for sure now. Jesse Whitaker had killed Billy Richardson, and she was going to make him pay for it. Detective Laura Jenkins stood outside Jesse Tex Whitaker's cell, her mind whirling with the weight of what she had uncovered. The confrontation with Tex had brought her closer to the truth, but there was something still missing, a small detail perhaps, that would tip the scales and seal his fate. As she walked back toward her office, the corridors of the Texas State Penitentiary felt more like a labyrinth than ever before, a place where truth was constantly hidden, buried under layers of lies, manipulation, and fear. But Jenkins wasn't deterred. She knew she was getting closer. Tex had confessed more than he realized during their confrontation. His bitterness, his anger, his need for revenge. All of it was rooted in one thing: betrayal. Billy Richardson had infected him with HIV, and Tex had allowed that rage to fester until it consumed him completely. Still, Jenkins couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. There was a piece of the puzzle that was still missing, something that would tie everything together, something that would make the case irrefutable. Tex had to be held accountable for the murder, but the evidence was still not enough to secure a conviction. She needed a confession, something concrete, something that would leave no room for doubt. As Jenkins sat at her desk, reviewing the reports and evidence collected so far, An idea began to form. She'd been talking to the wrong people. Tex had been the one to kill Richardson, but there were others who might have witnessed something, or heard something, that could make the case airtight. Her eyes landed on the medical records again, and the key to the case clicked into place. She needed to focus on the medical staff. There had to be someone who had seen something suspicious, someone who had either turned a blind eye or been coerced into silence. Jenkins knew how prison politics worked. If a guard was involved in something like this, there would be whispers among the medical staff. Someone had to know something. Jenkins picked up the phone and dialed the number of Dr. Elena Foster, the prison's chief medical officer. Dr. Foster was a woman who had been in the system for years, known for her level-headedness and her no-nonsense attitude. If anyone could help Jenkins make sense of the medical side of this case, it was Dr. Foster. "Detective Jenkins, what can I do for you?" Dr. Foster's voice crackled through the line, calm but with a hint of weariness. "I need your help, Doctor." "Foster," Jenkins said, leaning forward in her chair. "I'm investigating the death of Officer Billy Richardson, and it looks like there may have been more going on than just an affair. I'm looking into HIV test results for the inmates in the past year. Can you help me with that?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jenkins could almost hear the wheels turning in Dr. Foster's mind. "I can give you the names of the inmates who tested positive for HIV," she said slowly. "But I need to remind you that this is confidential information. I can't just hand over medical records without cause." "I understand," Jenkins said. "I'm investigating a murder, Doctor. Foster, Officer Richardson was killed, and I believe his HIV infection has something to do with it. If any of the inmates were involved, I need to know. There could be something you saw, something you heard. If I can't get the full picture, we might miss the key piece of the puzzle." Dr. Foster was silent for a moment before replying. "You're sure about this? I know you're working with limited evidence, but if what you're suggesting is true, we're talking about something much bigger than just a guard's affair. This could tear the prison apart." Jenkins nodded, even though Dr. Foster couldn't see her. "I know, but this is the only lead we've got. Please, Dr. Foster, I need your help." There was another pause, but then Dr. Foster relented. "Okay, I'll pull the records and see if there's anything that stands out. I'll call you back later today. But detective, be careful. The staff here aren't exactly keen on stirring up trouble. You might get resistance." "I understand," Jenkins replied. "Thanks for your help." As she hung up the phone, Jenkins felt a renewed sense of urgency. This case wasn't just about catching a murderer. It was about exposing a systemic failure, a betrayal of trust that ran deep within the walls of the Texas State Penitentiary. If there was one thing Jenkins had learned in her years as a detective, it was that people often underestimated the lengths to which some would go to protect their own. Her phone rang a few hours later. Dr. Foster's voice came through, tight with concern. "I've got the records," Dr. Foster said, sounding more serious than before. "You were right. There's something odd here. Jesse Whitaker, Marcus Donovan, and Timmy Henderson, all three of them tested positive for HIV within a few months of each other. And the timing is disturbing." Jenkins felt a surge of adrenaline. "What do you mean by disturbing?" "The tests show that their diagnoses were all relatively recent," Dr. Foster continued. "But what stands out to me is the overlap. Richardson's name is listed in their medical notes as the officer who administered some of the tests. There was a period last year where he was the one who oversaw the routine screenings for new inmates and those who were at risk. These three men, along with a few others, were tested during that time, and those results were all marked positive." Jenkins's heart skipped a beat. "So you're saying Richardson was involved in administering the HIV test to the very men he was having an affair with?" "It looks that way, Doctor," Foster said. "But that's not all. There's a note in one of the records that raises even more questions. It says Richardson was concerned about the health of certain inmates, including Whitaker. He requested additional testing for some of them, specifically for HIV, and it was done privately. No one else knew about it. That's highly unusual." Jenkins felt a chill run through her spine. "And you're telling me that Richardson may have knowingly infected these men?" "It's possible," Dr. Foster replied. But I can't say for sure without more information. There are some inconsistencies in the records. If Richardson did knowingly infect them, it would be considered criminal negligence at the very least. If he intentionally exposed them to the virus, Jenkins didn't need to hear the rest. She had all the confirmation she needed. Richardson had used his position to manipulate and control these inmates. He had infected them, perhaps without their knowledge at first, but the truth had likely come to light. The affair, the HIV, the manipulation, it all pointed back to one thing: revenge. Thanks, Dr. Foster. This is exactly what I needed, Jenkins said, her mind racing. I'm going to confront Tex again. Be careful, Detective, Dr. Foster cautioned. This is bigger than you think. You're walking a fine line. Jenkins didn't need to be told twice. She was going in, not just to solve a murder, but to expose a system of corruption that had gone unchecked for too long. With the new evidence in hand, Jenkins made her way to the prison once again. The walls seemed even more oppressive now, as though the very air itself was conspiring to keep the truth hidden. She knew that confronting Tex Whitaker would be the final step in closing the case, and this time, she wasn't going to leave until she had him in her grip. Detective Laura Jenkins felt a sense of finality as she approached Jesse, Tex Whitaker's cell. It had taken weeks of painstaking investigation, countless hours spent piecing together fragments of information, and the kind of gut instinct that had made her one of the best detectives in Texas. Now she was finally standing at the edge of a breakthrough. Tex had killed Officer Billy Richardson, but it wasn't just because of a fleeting moment of rage. It was revenge, a cold, calculated response to betrayal, one that had been simmering for months. And now Jenkins had the pieces to prove it. This time, when Jenkins entered the dark, musty cell block, Tex didn't seem to care that she was coming for him again. He was lounging in a chair, a small smile playing at the edges of his lips, as though he knew exactly what was coming. But this time, Jenkins wouldn't let him manipulate the conversation. The power had shifted. She had the facts now, and Tex could no longer deny the role he had played in Richardson's murder. As Jenkins approached the bars of his cell, Tex didn't even rise to greet her. His hands were casually folded across his chest, his eyes meeting hers with the same cold, calculating stare he always had. But there was something else now, a flicker of discomfort in the way he shifted in his chair. Well, well, Tex said, his voice low and steady. I'm guessing you're back to try and crack me open again. Is that it, Detective? Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out the file that had been growing thicker with every passing day. She placed it on the small table next to her, the heavy thud of the folder hitting the surface, sending a quiet signal to Tex that this time, things were different. I'm not here to play games, Tex, Jenkins said, her voice unwavering. I've got the answers you've been hiding for weeks. And now, you're going to tell me the truth. No more lies. Tex's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened ever so slightly. He was trying to mask his unease, but Jenkins could tell that the walls he had carefully built around himself were starting to crumble. I told you before, Tex muttered, his voice almost a growl. I didn't kill Richardson. You're wasting your time. Jenkins nodded slowly, as though considering his words. You didn't kill him? Tell me then, Tex, how do you explain the DNA evidence from the crime scene? How do you explain the blood that matched your HIV status? Tex's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Jenkins could see the way he clenched his jaw, his fists tightening in his lap. He was holding it together, but barely. He was losing his grip. That doesn't mean anything, Tex said through gritted teeth. I wasn't the only one in that room. Jenkins stepped closer to the bars, leaning in slightly. But you were the one who had the most to lose, Tex. You were the one infected by Richardson, just like the other men. You were the one who felt the sting of betrayal, of being used. Richardson didn't just give you a disease. He took away your dignity. He played God with your life. And that's why you killed him, isn't it? Tex remained silent, his gaze shifting to the floor as if he were contemplating her words. But Jenkins could see the internal battle raging inside him. He didn't want to admit the truth. He wanted to stay in control, but the pressure was mounting, and Jenkins knew this was her moment. I have the medical records, Tex, Jenkins continued, her voice steady. I know you knew. I know you found out that you were infected right before Richardson's death. You were scared, you were angry, and you wanted revenge. The problem was, Richardson had already manipulated you once. You weren't about to let him get away with it again. Tex's eyes snapped up to meet hers, and for the first time Jenkins saw a crack in his facade. There was a flicker of vulnerability there, a flash of rage that betrayed the calm exterior he had carefully cultivated. He wasn't just angry at Jenkins. He was angry at himself. He was angry at Richardson. And most of all, he was angry at the world for giving him a death sentence he couldn't escape. You don't know what it's like, Tex said, his voice suddenly quieter, rawer. You don't know what it's like to have your life ripped away from you, to be condemned to a slow death. Richardson, he thought he could play with us, use us, but I wasn't going to let him keep playing that game. I wasn't going to let him keep pretending he had control. Jenkins didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. Justifications, rationalizations, excuses. But this time she wasn't about to let him off the hook. Tex, she said, her voice firm, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to make sure you pay for what you did. You didn't just kill a man because of a disease. You killed him because he used his power to manipulate and control you. You killed him to silence him, to keep him from hurting anyone else. But you didn't count on the fact that someone would come after the truth. You didn't count on me. Tex's fist clenched so tightly now that his knuckles were white, and Jenkins could see the rage bubbling up inside him. But he didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was all the confession Jenkins needed. I know about the affair, Jenkins continued, her voice lowering. I know Richardson made you believe you were special. He made you think you were different from the others. But he was using you, Tex. He was using you all. And when you found out the truth, when you realized what he had done, you couldn't forgive him, couldn't let it go. Tex took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of containing the emotions that threatened to spill over. Finally he spoke, his voice low but filled with venom. Yeah, he muttered. You're right. He made me believe I was special. He made me think I was something more than just a criminal. He played me like a fool. But I wasn't the only one he hurt. He hurt the others too. He took something from all of us, and I was the one who made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else again. Jenkins watched him for a moment longer, her eyes hard. You took a life, Tex. You killed him. And no matter how you try to justify it, no matter how you try to explain it, that's what you did. You took a life. Tex's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. He had nothing more to say. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, as if both of them knew that the game was finally over. Jenkins turned and walked toward the door, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. I'll make sure the rest of the world knows the truth too, Tex. You're going to pay for what you did. As she exited the cell block, Jenkins could feel the pressure lifting slightly from her chest. The case was almost closed. Tex had admitted what she needed to hear, and now all she had to do was make sure the law took its course. But there was one thing that still lingered in her mind, one question that hadn't been answered yet. What other secrets were hidden behind the walls of the prison? What else had been covered up, buried beneath lies and manipulation? But for now, Jenkins knew that one thing was certain. Tex Whitaker was going down for the murder of Billy Richardson. The investigation was officially closed, but for Detective Laura Jenkins, the aftermath of the case lingered. As the days passed, she found herself replaying the events in her mind. The slow unraveling of the truth, the confrontation with Jesse Tex Whitaker, and finally the satisfaction of watching him falter under the weight of his own guilt. She had closed the case on Billy Richardson's murder, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something bigger that she hadn't fully uncovered. The prison had a way of hiding its darkest secrets, and Jenkins had a nagging sense that this case wasn't the only one that would come to light. Tex Whitaker had been convicted, and his trial was set to begin. The confession Jenkins had gotten, though indirect and incomplete, had been enough to put him behind bars for the rest of his life. The records, the medical findings, the witnesses, everything was in place to ensure that Tex would never walk free again. But Jenkins, ever the meticulous investigator, couldn't help but wonder about the system that allowed someone like Richardson to manipulate so many lives. His power, his ability to play God with people's fates. There was something deeply wrong with the way the prison system functioned, and Jenkins knew that the case of one dead officer wasn't going to fix that. The morning after Tex's confession, Jenkins sat in her office at the Texas State Police Department, sorting through the final details of the case. The file was thick with reports, statements, and medical records, more than enough to convict Tex. She was running through her notes when her phone rang. The call was from her captain, Lieutenant David Hayes, a seasoned cop with a no-nonsense attitude. "Jenkins," Hayes said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got a situation. It's about the Whitaker case. I think you need to come down to the department now." Jenkins' heart skipped a beat. She had expected the case to be closed, not to have another wrinkle added, but there was no time for hesitation. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, her mind racing with questions. What now? When Jenkins arrived at the department, Hayes was waiting for her in the briefing room, pacing back and forth like a man on edge. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of frustration and concern. "What's going on?" Jenkins asked, her voice steady but concerned. "I thought the case was wrapped up." Hayes stopped pacing and turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "It is, mostly, but something doesn't add up. The prison's medical records you got from Dr. Foster, they've been tampered with." Jenkins' eyes widened. "Tampered with? How do you mean?" "Several of the HIV test results, including Whitaker's, were altered in the system. We've traced the changes back to a certain time period when Richardson was still working at the prison. But here's the kicker. None of those changes were authorized by Dr. Foster or any other medical staff. Someone else was behind it." Jenkins felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was a case of corruption that reached much higher than she'd anticipated. "You're saying someone was covering for Whitaker? Or was it Richardson himself?" "We don't know yet," Hayes said, his voice tight with frustration. "But it's clear that someone with access to the system was altering the medical records to hide something. Perhaps to protect Whitaker, perhaps to protect Richardson. Either way, it's serious." Jenkins took a deep breath, trying to piece it all together. She had been so focused on the murder, the affair, the betrayal that she hadn't looked closely enough at the bigger picture. She had known the corruption in the prison ran deep, but she hadn't realized just how far it extended. "So what now?" Jenkins asked, her mind already spinning with possibilities. "What do we do next?" "We're pulling the records from every guard, every medical staff member who had access to those systems. But we need you to talk to the inmates, specifically the ones who were involved with Richardson in the HIV testing. I have a feeling they know more than they've let on." Jenkins nodded, her mind already shifting gears. The investigation wasn't over. It was just evolving. She had to get to the truth of how Richardson had used his power, how he had manipulated so many lives. But she also needed to understand how deep the rot in the system went. "I'll start with the inmates," Jenkins said already, moving toward the door. "You focus on tracing those records. We'll get to the bottom of this." As Jenkins headed back to the prison, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tex had confessed to killing Richardson, but there was still so much more that hadn't been revealed. She had to find out who else was involved, who else had been complicit in Richardson's manipulation, and most importantly, why they had covered up the truth for so long. At the prison, Jenkins sat down with a few of the men who had been tested by Richardson during the time of his affair with the inmates. They were reluctant to talk at first, but Jenkins knew how to handle prisoners. She had worked with them for years, and she knew how to earn their trust. One by one, they began to open up, each of them sharing more details about the environment Richardson had created. Richardson wasn't like the other guards. Marcus Donovan, one of the inmates who had tested positive for HIV, said quietly. "He wasn't just a guard. He made us feel like we mattered, like we were something more than just criminals. He told us things, gave us special treatment. He'd bring us food, talk to us, make us feel like we were his friends." Jenkins nodded, taking notes. "Did you ever feel like he was trying to control you?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward the guard standing nearby before he spoke again. "Yeah, maybe. He told me that I had to do certain things for him, or he'd make things difficult for me. But he said he could help me too. He made me think he was helping me." Jenkins pressed him further, asking about the relationship between Richardson and the other inmates involved. The pattern became clearer with every word Marcus spoke. Richardson had been using his position to manipulate the men, to make them feel special and indebted to him. But behind the facade of kindness and friendship, he had been wielding power like a weapon. "Did you ever see anything that might suggest he was hiding something about his own health?" Jenkins asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not until later, when we all started getting sick. When I found out I had HIV, I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't think about it at first. It wasn't until Tex started asking questions that I realized something was off. He was angry, but he was also right. Richardson did something to us. He took something from us, and he didn't care." Jenkins knew now that the case had grown beyond one murder. It was a tangled web of manipulation, power, and betrayal. Billy Richardson had used his authority to ruin lives, and the extent of his control had gone unchecked for far too long. The prison system had failed, and the men inside had been nothing more than pawns in his sick game. Tex had killed Richardson, but the real question now was, who else was involved, and how far did the corruption go? Jenkins felt a deep resolve settle within her. She would find the answers. No matter where they led, no matter how deep the rot went, she was going to tear it all down. Because now, more than ever, she knew that the truth wasn't just about justice for Richardson's death. It was about exposing the poison that had infected the prison system from the inside out.